Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're engaging in a structural analysis of a truly chaotic fracture in 20th century European history, the 1919 Munich Soviet Republic. We're going to clinically deconstruct the source material to trace how a brief spark of revolution rapidly spiraled into political isolation, petty bourgeois anarchist daydreams, and ultimately a brutally systematic massacre. Let's begin. Here's how we'll map out this rapid chronological sequence. First, the origins of the Republic. Second, the elections and political assassination. Third, petty bourgeois anarchist illusions. Fourth, the communist intervention. And finally, the counter-revolutionary massacre. Part 1. Origins of the Republic. The fall of autocracy. When the German Revolution began in November 1918, the Bavarian autocracy collapsed almost overnight. Now, you might wonder why a deeply Catholic, traditionally reactionary region would join the revolution so early. Well, it fundamentally came down to their absolute disdain for the Prussians. They desperately wanted regional autonomy and distance from the total disaster of the First World War. Consequently, Bavaria became the only German region to form peasants' councils, aiming to strictly insulate themselves from the Prussian collapse. Stepping into this regional power vacuum was Kurt Eisner. As the source text correctly identifies, his administration was fundamentally opportunist. He was a pacifist intellectual trying to hold together an incredibly fragile alliance between the USPD, revisionist elements, and the Bavarian Peasants League. As prime minister, Eisner played heavily to regionalist sentiment, hoping the Allies would offer better peace terms if he just blamed Prussian militarism. But crucially, his ambiguous stance toward the workers' councils, he really had no intention of handing over actual power, set the stage for severe opposition. Part 2. Elections and political assassination, the political vacuum. The sheer scale of Eisner's political isolation becomes undeniably clear when we look at the January 1919 electoral data. It was an absolute disaster for him. His independent party secured a disastrous 2.5% of the vote. The SPD took 33%, while the bourgeois parties utterly dominated with 65%. The numbers simply don't lie. Eisner was isolated and had absolutely zero mandate from the masses. Despite this complete electoral rejection, Eisner stubbornly refused to dissolve his government. But on February 21st, literally on the very day he finally planned to resign, he was assassinated by a right-wing nationalist. This sparked immediate retaliatory shootings of political figures across the spectrum. What we're left with is an extreme political vacuum. The newly formed SPD-led Hoffmann government was paralyzed from its inception and was swiftly forced to flee Munich for northern Bavaria, leaving the capital totally devoid of central authority. Part 3. Petty bourgeois anarchist illusions, the First Soviet. To accurately categorize the First Soviet Republic proclaimed on April 7th, we have to rely on the specific taxonomy of the source material, petty bourgeois anarchism, and it's an absolutely crucial distinction to make. This was not a working-class uprising. It was the radicalism of an intellectual bohemian stratum, primarily out of Munich's Schwabing district, who were entirely incapable of serious political reflection. Faced with the realities of power, they substituted bombastic phrases and showy theatrical gestures for actual material class struggle. Recognizing this deep structural flaw, the KPD, the German Communist Party, maintained a strict theoretical distance. They rightly categorized this April 7th Republic as a creature of conciliatory compromise and pure anarchist fantasy. For the KPD, a true Soviet republic inherently demands the organized action of the masses. Since mass action was completely absent here, they absolutely refused to become accomplices to what they saw as a premature, artificial putsch orchestrated by a clique of bohemian politicians. The primary source text offers a perfectly scathing critique of this environment through the words of Paul Froelich, who was on the ground at the time. He witnessed Munich surrender to an orgy of red flags and of words. His assessment is incredibly sharp. No one in leadership realized the actual harshness of the class struggle. This maximalist addiction to emotional phraseology over rational political strategy basically guaranteed the collapse of the First Soviet. Part 4. The Communist Intervention. A hopeless defense. So we have to methodically contrast these two successive governments. You have the First Soviet, which was a chaotic assembly of anarchists, independents, and compromised SPD ministers operating purely on illusions. The Second Soviet, however, emerged under entirely different material conditions. When the Republican Guard attempted a putsch on April 13th to overthrow the first government, the KPD finally intervened under the leadership of Eugene Lavigny. They decisively defeated the putsch, dissolved the first government, and organized a resolute, disciplined defense, even though they fully recognized it was essentially a hopeless endeavor. Now, you might be asking, why intervene at all if military defeat is an absolute certainty? Well, the source provides a very clear theoretical justification. The KPD didn't step in with the illusion of victory. They intervened because they felt a profound historical duty to the working class. The fight was already upon them. By taking command, their objective was to strip away those petty bourgeois anarchist illusions, focus all remaining energy on defending the proletariat, and essentially transform a guaranteed military defeat into a permanent, educational, revolutionary lesson for the future. Part 5. The Counter-Revolutionary Massacre. Suppression and Reaction. To truly grasp the scale of the counter-revolutionary violence that followed, we have to turn to the statistical data. Emil Julius Gumbel quantified 4 straight years of deeply entrenched, systemic political assassinations drenching Germany in blood, starting in November 1918. When the exiled Hoffmann government begged for Gustav Noska's military intervention, they brought this exact calculated machinery of death directly down upon Munich. The military suppression by the Freikorps in May was clinically barbaric. Under martial law, victims were seized indiscriminately in streets, cellars, and their own homes. We're looking at over 1,000 slaughtered, with final pockets of resistance literally incinerated by flamethrowers. The treatment of the dead was systematically dehumanizing. Corpses were stripped and indecently stacked at collection points. The terror was widespread. On May 6th, 21 Catholics, falsely accused of being Spartacists, were massacred. And the intellectual leadership was brutally liquidated. Gustav Landauer was beaten to death, and Eugen Levine was shot by firing squad. The structural aftermath of this massacre permanently altered the region's DNA. This is a vital takeaway from the text. Following the slaughter and the imposition of a military regime, Munich was systematically transformed into the chief breeding ground for extreme counter-revolution in Germany. It's a matter of historical record that just 4 years later, this very city hosted Adolf Hitler's first abortive putsch. Furthermore, the crushing defeat here heavily influenced the psychological trauma and strategic inadequacies of German communists, directly incubating future feudal adventures like the disastrous March Action in 1921. Which brings us to a final, crucial question for you to consider. Based on this structural analysis, how did the combination of naive political illusions and utterly ruthless military repression in 1919 directly pave the way for the extreme right-wing fascism of the 1920s? The historical through-line is undeniable, and the consequences, as we know, were absolute catastrophe. Thank you for joining us for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.